Okay, everyone, we are going to go ahead and get started. Our CEO is not able to join us in person today, so we will kick off the webinar with a video from Marcella.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited that you all decided to join us today. Welcome. My name is Marcella Middleton, and I'm the CEO with lived experience of Away Home America. For those of you that may be unfamiliar with Away Home America, it's a national advocacy organization. We offer public policy innovations as a vehicle to grassroots campaigns. We're a national organization that seeks to prevent and end youth homelessness by working to change policies at the federal, state, and local levels. We don't do any direct services like running a homeless shelter or case management. We work directly with policymakers and legislators seeking policy and administrative or regulatory changes that have historically marginalized youth and young adults. We're grateful to have you joining us for our second annual Trash and Treasure webinar. So to level set a little bit, I want to be clear that we're not going to talk about any specific bill numbers. We're going to have a high-level conversation about legislation that has been introduced in state legislatures across the country in 2024. The goal is to be clear about what's helpful, which is the treasure, and what may have been harmful, which is the trash, as we're thinking about supporting youth and young adults across the country. If you find that you're having a visceral reaction to the title, Trash and Treasure, I invite you to step out of that space and lead with curiosity. That's what we do here at Away Home America. We lead with curiosity and step into a space of partnership with us to focus on preventing and ending youth homelessness. So we can't accomplish our goal today unless we're willing to have honest conversations with each other about what's working and what's not working with legislation across the country. So additionally, what we call honorable mentions will include proposals that either have trash and treasure in the same bill or bills that do not explicitly mention youth and young adults across the country at the lowest access point. Finally, as Away Home America predominantly focuses our advocacy efforts on our 118th Congressional Policy Agenda, which include Recs 4 through 6, or recommendations 4 through 6, we're going to start off our webinar with these. This year, our team used keyword searches for all 6 of our policy recommendations, again, coming out of our 118th Congressional Policy Agenda, to look up legislation that was relative, connected, or really reflected the work that we're doing in our 4 to 6 policy recommendations. And what that really resulted in is us finding 11,515 pieces of legislation. Through that process, what they came up with is very specific trends for each of those policy recommendations, which our moderator is going to share with you all today. So to be clear, all of these policy recommendations that we're talking about now come directly from our New Deal to End Youth Homelessness policy proposal. So if you all are not familiar with that, I really want to invite you to go check out our website and just mosey around and look at what youth and young adults from around the country and other experts have come up with in terms of what needs to change in policies to prevent and end youth homelessness. I really do love our New Deal to End Youth Homelessness because it's a very clear pathway from where we are currently to where we want to be. And that really reflects transformation of these systems. And we invite you all to be champions of our New Deal to End Youth Homelessness. So I would like to thank you all for being here. We're so very much appreciated. We're not going to stop here. So if you enjoy today's webinar, I invite you to tell a friend, and invite more people, because we need more champions in the work that we're doing, because we need to be able to put a spotlight on the youth and young adults that are experiencing homelessness so that we can end it and prevent it for good. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Josh Kogan, who is Away Home America's Public Policy Director, but also our host and moderator for today's webinar. Josh?
Thank you, Marcella, and welcome everyone. This year, as Marcella mentioned, this is our second annual Trash and Treasure. We are especially grateful and honored to be joined by a few legislators from across the country. As mentioned earlier, though we are honored with our special guest speakers this year who have direct experience in introducing relative legislation to our various topics of discussion today, we will not be mentioning any specific bill numbers nor participating in any calls to action that would be perceived as direct or grassroots lobbying. Disclaimer out of the way. We invite you all into a space of curious conversation as we look at a broad landscape of happenings across the country that would either be helpful or harmful in the movement to prevent and end youth homelessness. For our format today, we will first discuss Away Home America's fourth through sixth policy recommendations. We'll then pause for a brief Q&A section and then follow suit with recommendations 1 through 3 with another brief Q&A section. For our first topic, actualizing reparations for Black Americans, I'll give us a brief legislative overview and then invite our first guest to discuss further. Though our fourth policy recommendation also provides for the intersectionality of land stewardship of stolen land from indigenous peoples, the states of Nebraska, New Jersey, Maryland, and Tennessee each had transformative visions of actualizing reparations for Black Americans in their respective states. Oklahoma receives our trash award this year with this recommendation as legislation that would allow institutions of higher education to remove any requirements and or standards related to students learning about history relative to anything considered to be under the DEI CRT, that is diversity, equity, inclusion, and critical race theory umbrella. We believe this is in direct opposition to a transformed future state, which must include the education of communities surrounding the naming and challenging of white supremacy and how, since our country's earliest beginnings, this has systematically harmed Black and Indigenous communities. Now, California receives the honorable mention with a few pieces of legislation that are well-intended first steps. However, one piece of note does not account for the generations of harm, nor the breadth and the depth of policy that has blatantly, systematically, and disproportionately impacted Black communities outside of specific home displacement, specifically relating to eminent domain. With that, I would like to welcome Nebraska State Senator Terrell McKinney from Nebraska's 11th State Senate District. And as our time together is short, we'll jump right in.
How y'all doing?
Welcome, Senator.
I'm good. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you so much for for joining us today. My first question for you to share with the group is, why is this recommendation so important to you in your role as a state senator in Nebraska?
It's important to me because I think, like, for me as a black man and a black official in the state of Nebraska, because I think few people realize that at times I go across the country and I meet people and I'm like, oh, you're a senator from Nebraska. I didn't know there were black people there. But also, when you dig into the history, I don't think people realize that enslaved Africans were held in the state of Nebraska or spent time in the state of Nebraska. The Buffalo Soldiers were also in the state at a time as well. And also, I just strongly believe that there is a debt due to descendants of enslaved Africans in this country, no matter where individuals reside. And I think the state of Nebraska has a part to pay. And I thought it was important for me as a state senator to continue that fight, like others have been doing across the country. And I wanted to do my part.
Wonderful, thank you. And building on that, specifically honing in on something you said, given that it's 2024, why do you think there is still a lot of hesitancy and pushback and just straight up opposition around actualizing reparations for Black Americans, whether it's at the state or federal level?
There's many reasons. I mean, white supremacy, racism. I think also a lack of understanding. I think people also,
don't like to acknowledge what happened in this country and how this country was formed and how this country was built on the black backs of enslaved Africans and how for many years there was many people who built this country and who were pretty much, giving free labor to this country and were owed a debt that was never paid after, the Emancipation Proclamation. People talk about the 40 acres and a mule, and that was never paid. And then you talk about reparations and how, slave owners were pretty much given some sort of reparations when the enslaved Africans weren't given anything essentially. So I think it's a lack of understanding, but it's a lack of not wanting to understand. But then you couple that with racism and white supremacy, and people say like, oh, like what does that mean? Or it can't just be money, or it can't just be this, or how much is it, or just all these things of why it can't happen. And then it's like, okay, at the end of the day, let's study it, let's get a better understanding of it, and then let's figure out how can we figure it out. I don't think it should just be a dollar amount. I think it should be land, it should be monetary, it should be multiple things, but just saying no just to say no, to me is just not realistic because a debt is owed.
You for that. And as we close this section, are there any final thoughts that you would like to leave the audience with as it relates to this particular recommendation?
I would say that for me, I think people should, begin to continue to like speak up more about it and continue to do more research on the topic if you don't feel comfortable discussing it. I know for some people it has always been like a taboo conversation. Today it still is in a lot of rooms where if you bring up reparations, people get hesitant to talk about it because you're like, oh, reparations, oh, let's not talk about that. But let's be honest, this country was built on the backs of enslaved Africans. That is a fact that we cannot escape. And until we acknowledge it, we're always going to, in my opinion, have to deal with that and not ever get to a space where we could ever move forward unless we deal with our past. So I think we as a country and we as a people, we have to deal with that. And a part of dealing with that is acknowledging that descendants of those people deserve to be compensated for what happened to our people. And it didn't just stop with slavery. You talk about Jim Crow, you talk about Reconstruction, and you talk about the era where, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and the civil rights era, like a lot of things have happened, and it didn't just stop after slavery. So it's a complex situation, but it's something that is definitely needed and something that we shouldn't just shut up about because people feel like it's a debt that can't be paid. Because I think anything can be paid, and something is better than nothing.
Thank you very much, Senator McKinney, one for your leadership and two for joining us today. If you are able to stay on, there will be a Q&A section and someone might have a question for you regarding this recommendation. But with that, we will move to our next recommendation. We are actually jumping to six. We're coming back to five. But our sixth recommendation is to end the use of police in all forms of punishment, retribution, and control in homeless services, education, and child welfare settings. So I'll give us a brief legislative overview again before inviting our next guest on. The state of Colorado receives the Treasure Award for this recommendation, as there were two particular pieces of legislation that were both signed by the governor into state law. one that will take a really solid first step towards shifting from policing and punitive measures to addressing justice-engaged students' full range of emotional and psychological needs, and another one that is in alignment with Recommendation 6's proposed solution of comprehensive funding to provide extensive support for youth aging out of the child welfare system and other youth-serving systems, including housing assistance, educational support, and mentorship programs. With no honorable mention award for this particular recommendation this year, our trash award goes to the state of Florida for legislation approved by the governor and signed into law this legislative session that not only blatantly attacks migrant and undocumented communities, but is in direct opposition of our New Deal to End Youth Homelessness immigration justice pillar. It also opens potential avenues to blatantly discriminate homeless and or housing insecure folks who may not have the deemed proper identification by the state. With that, we are pivoting a little bit. I would like to welcome Fred Ginyard, our Organizing and Policy Director. Representative Jennifer Bacon from Colorado's 7th State House District was slated to speak with us, but unfortunately was gavelled into a special session in the state legislature literally within the last hour. So thank you, Fred, for jumping in and joining us and doing what we do best here at Away Home America and pivoting where we need to pivot. So with that, let's get started. So Fred, first and foremost, why is this recommendation important to you in working with state and local communities?
Sure. So again, hello everybody, and I'm super happy to jump in for the rep. Although we definitely look forward to hopefully having her soon. So I come from actual youth organizing. My very first experience of organizing was at 13 in high school, and dealing with school police officers or back in the day, because I'm a little older. They were NTAs, right? And NTAs would show up when maybe we're having a rough day. And then depending on the climate, that NTA was like, yeah, we're gonna have to call, we gotta call someone else because they have escalated the situation. And when I say they, I mean the school resource officer, NTA, was the person who, instead of engaging to de-escalate, actually elevated the situation to a point where it was not necessary. I went to a high school where you could get a 10-day suspension if you didn't wear a belt. And rightfully so, young people would get really frustrated and be like, why are you suspending me? Like, I actually came to school. I showed up. So I don't have a belt on. Like, at least I'm here. And those were moments that really at points blew up beyond what it actually needed to be in those situations. And so for me, as I think about my role with Away Home America, and in particular looking at state and local policy, I think for me, it's really clear that when we talk about homelessness, right, there's a direct connection to how young people are showing up into schools, what they may or may not have, right? Whether that is the physical property that someone has, the mental states that our young people are in, and all the trauma that comes with homelessness. And those things show up in our schools, right? Like they show up when folk get triggered, and the immediate response shouldn't be police officers, which unfortunately happens in a lot of schools. It should be connecting to resource officers, counselors, school psychologists, right? But that doesn't actually happen, right? And according to the Public Free Schools website and report, right, there are 14 million students who are going to schools without any type of nurse, a counselor, a school psychologist, a social worker, but there are police in their schools, right? And so there's no one there to really address the needs. And as someone who went through our public education system as a young Black person, right, like my interactions with police was already negative, right? Like there was already distrust just walking down the street. And then to be in a school that I'm supposed to be safe, where I'm supposed to be able to explore and grow as a human being, as an individual, and learn, and then be met with police hostility because I'm having a moment where I'm learning to control my emotions doesn't help. And so for me, this is part of why this recommendation is so important, is because we must move away from police in schools.
Thank you, Fred. And in closing, is there any final thought that you would like to leave the audience with as it relates to this particular recommendation?
My thought, the last thing that I will say, right, is that when we think about schools, oftentimes folks think about our young people and assume that they're too young to engage in these conversations. I was 13 engaging in this conversation. And at 17, I was working with middle school students. It wasn't specifically around police in schools, but it was around like protecting their schools from like privatization, which then led to some increased policing. But there are middle school students who were able to have this level of conversation, right? And so as you think about bills, as you think about policy, as you think about even starting these conversations, the conversation has to start with young people at the table, right? You can't start it and bring them in later, because that's not how that works, right? Like that's not successful, right? Like I encourage you to be transformative in your approach and in your thinking, right? And bringing young people to the table at the front, right? Even when it's the thought of an idea, have young people at the table because they're the best folk to really guide the process. Thank you all.
Thank you, Fred. And before we move to our brief Q&A time for this particular section, we will now move to recommendation number 5, to abolish laws and policies that criminalize and end the institutionalization and incarceration in addressing homelessness. So first and foremost, this year's Treasure Award for this recommendation goes to the state of Rhode Island. Though we would prefer no evictions of encampments in a perfect world without a safe and stable home for folks to go to, creating a Bill of Rights for our homeless neighbors that also mandates police department compliance regarding both privacy and intent and unreasonable searches is a solid step towards transformation. Now, Arizona, California, and Oklahoma all received the collective trash award for our 5th recommendation this year. Unfortunately, and why we moved this recommendation to the last section in the Recs 4 through 6 um, part is, unfortunately, as many of us on this webinar know, in the wake of the Grants Pass v. Johnson decision, we will most likely continue to see state legislation that directly criminalizes those experiencing homelessness. Though not signed into law this particular session, one of these states even went a step further to create a measure that would authorize law enforcement to create a database of such orders that uses photo matching software in order to track those living in encampments, which we view as particularly harmful. Now, our honorable mention goes to Colorado for legislation passed into law. While this was a good starting point of what a comprehensive Bill of Rights could look like for youth and young adults, it only applies to 18 to 21-year-olds, specifically in the Foster Youth and Transition Program, but does not limit or supersede the right of parents, nor does it apply to youth detained or in the care of the Department of Human Services Division of Youth Services. With that, I would like to invite our next guest, Representative Stewart, into discussion on this topic. So we'll jump on in after you introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Jennifer Stewart, and I represent the 59th Rhode Island House District. And I'm just thrilled to have the opportunity to talk about the Homeless Bill of Rights in Rhode Island and efforts to strengthen it that I've been a part of.
Yeah, so with that, we'll jump in. Why is this recommendation important to you in your role as a state representative in Rhode Island?
Well, in general, for me as a legislator, I believe that our state is only as good as we take care of those most vulnerable in our communities. And so the focus of my work as a legislator has been trying to zero in on those most vulnerable, and what can we do policy-wise to uplift them, because I think in uplifting their situation and their conditions, it's better for everybody in the state. So in this case of this legislation in 2012, Rhode Island did something historic by passing the first homeless bill of rights in the US. And what that did was affirm that the unhoused have the same rights as everyone else. And at that time, only 12 years ago, it was a big deal that Rhode Island did that, because it stood in contrast to other possible responses to the unhoused. So those responses that stigmatize, criminalize, and basically abuse the most sort of economically unfortunate among us. And at the time, advocacy organizations on behalf of the unhoused recognized that Rhode Island could be a leader in the US, potentially in that issue. And in the 12 years that have followed, Connecticut and Illinois enacted similar Bill of Rights legislation, and a number of states have proposed doing so. But the problem that we've run into during the last 12 years is that even though we've got this Bill of Rights, which is great, it's very experiences have shown that municipalities are sometimes very willing to disregard the rights of the unhoused. And there have been just some really shameful occurrences of people's temporary housing tents being unlawfully searched. And, those tents destroyed in the process, people's belongings destroyed or thrown away. Similarly, encampments being forcibly evicted with little notice and with little respect shown for people's belongings. And consequently, many advocacy organizations in Rhode Island said, we need more teeth in our Bill of Rights. And so I worked with them to try to develop what those teeth could be. Because normally, under our Constitution, our Bill of Rights and the Constitution, it sets a standard, but we know in reality, the fact that we have a Bill of Rights doesn't prevent anybody from violating someone's rights. But what it does do is, by being in the Constitution, it allows those who have had their rights violated to file a complaint, file a lawsuit, right? To seek some kind of redress for having their rights violated. In Rhode Island, despite the presence of that Bill of Rights and in recognition of the conditions that I just described to you, the reality was that the people's conditions of being unhoused aren't really conducive to being plaintiffs in a lawsuit and being able to file a lawsuit and actually see that process through. being involved in cases like that requires a level of stability and resources, even if an organization, let's say like the like a rights organization decides to like sponsor a lawsuit. So so the result in trying to address a host of these problems based on lived experience was the legislation that I introduced. So, I mean, the bottom line is that, you know, we need now, as the unhoused problem has grown only bigger in Rhode Island, we need a stronger message sent to people in power about what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. And that's basically it.
Are there any final thoughts that you would like to leave the audience with before we jump into our Q&A?
The only thing I would say is that, you know, to keep an eye out for ordinances at the city level and state laws that appear that they'll be equally applied to everyone, but in reality will be selectively enforced against the unhoused, for example. And these show up in a host of ways, from you know, restrictions on solicitation of people in cars, to certain sanitary requirements, to maybe restrictions on public camping. The reality of those sort of seemingly general restrictions is that they'll be selectively enforced upon the unhoused. So that could be one of the discrete or kind of under the radar ways that the unhoused get criminalized in our legal system.
You very much, Representative Stewart, and I would ask you the same if you could stay on with us. We are going to open up our webinar for questions from the audience. This is a very short time frame, so we have 3 minutes, but we ask that you keep your questions succinct so that we may get to as many questions as possible. Feel free to raise your hand and come off mute, or put your question in the chat, and it can be on anything regarding recommendations 4, 5, or 6. And we will have another Q&A section at the end of Recs 1 through 3 as well. Yes, Katie, go ahead.
Hi all. It took me a minute to find the raise hand function. I'm on my phone. So I really appreciate this conversation, and I just wanted to the representative from Rhode Island, to kind of the point of the difficulty of sort of putting the burden on someone who's unhoused to have to like enforce their rights when, you know, when we're lucky enough to get them passed through state law. I was wondering if you had any thoughts around like how we can still ensure that those rights are enforced without it having to be like every individual whose rights are violated. I know that like I'm wondering if there can be uh, just some creative ideas around how to ensure that those rights are enforced and not like already burdening people who are in crisis.
Well, one of the ways that we're thinking about it, and one of the ways we put forward in the legislation that was referred to today, was to have advocacy groups be able, so for like third-party advocacy groups on behalf of the unhoused, be able to file suits on behalf of people who have had their rights violated, seeking in part, well, any kind of monetary damages to actually go to our Department of Housing for programming needs concerning Rhode Island's unhoused population. So that's one of the ways that we've been thinking about it. Really, because those are the frontline organizations that know what's happening to people. And, why not empower them to be able to file these lawsuits on the behalf of the clientele they work with?
Thank you very much. And with that, we are going to move to our next section. Again, we started with Recs 4 through 6 because that's where our efforts were focused here in the 2024 calendar year. And now we will go to recommendations 1 through 3. If you have any questions, hopefully we will be able to get to them in our next Q&A section. But now we'll kick off this last segment with recommendation number 1, a nationally funded low or no barrier cash transfer program. And though this recommendation focuses on a federal landscape, we will highlight legislative happenings for this topic at the state level. So the Treasurer Award here goes to the state of Washington with introduced legislation that would be accessible to state residents 18 years or older, or who have been emancipated and have important alignments of assuring that those who are emancipated exiting foster care, the juvenile or criminal justice system, and with the status of being an immigrant, asylee, or refugee are all still eligible for this program, while also taking into account the fair market price in rent to determine monthly payments. Now, both Arizona and Idaho received the Trash Award for similar legislation, one of which was vetoed and the other signed by their respective governors, with the same aim of prohibiting guaranteed income programs by any local governments. Lastly, our honorable mention here goes to the state of Illinois. While there are components of introduced legislation that pave a path towards transformation, such as mandating that 2 members of the implementation board have had or currently have experience with direct cash transfers, there unfortunately is no compensation for these board members that we could tell of, nor is there any solid confirmation as to whether or not this program would count as income and a process to assure participants will keep other benefits or some form of support for the potential loss of said benefits. And with that, I would like to welcome Casman Ramos, the U.S. Program Manager for Give Directly, to briefly discuss this topic with us.
Thanks for using my good photo, Josh. Appreciate it.
That was all Aurora, and you are welcome.
But yes, my name is Casman Ramos, and I work for Give Directly. I'm a U.S. program manager, so I've worked on a variety of guaranteed income programs throughout the country. And one of the things that makes cash so important to me and so personal is just that I grew up in poverty, raised by my grandma who received Social Security benefits. And not only does she help support me when my parents were busy or my mom was still in college when she had me, but she also served her community. So with her little, I don't even know what it was back then, but like $900 a month, she was helping me, feeding her community, and just being really a pillar. And so to me, cash is very personal. So thank you for letting me be here to talk about it.
Of course. So at a high level, from your lens of expertise, why would a direct cash transfer or guaranteed income program be treasured, aka helpful, for youth and young adults experiencing and or at risk of experiencing homelessness?
Yeah, so not to take up too much of your time, but I used to be a guardian ad litem, and one of the things I did in that role was to represent kids who were victims of child abuse and neglect in the court system. And so often we forget that a lot of youth don't have youth voice in the courts. It's usually just the parent and it's the state, and they're kind of haggling over the outcomes of someone who definitely has their own agency and should be empowered. And from that work, I had so many kids, but especially this one I can think of. And she had been in foster care for so long and she was a teen. And you probably know everybody that getting adopted as a teen is very difficult, and it often doesn't happen. And at the age of 18, wherever you are, you could be with a home that's temporary, or you could be in a group home or anything like that. Things can end suddenly once you turn 18. And if you don't have any access to resources, or the family that you were separated from isn't available to you, you don't really have anything to move forward with. And you're kind of behind the 8 ball once you are technically an adult. And so one of the things that I saw was just that how important it would be to have access to cash, like your own money, to make your own choices, to feel empowered, especially kids like this. So a kid that's been in foster care for so long, they've already had to make a lot of decisions about what's best for them, what opportunities to take, which things to stay away from, just so they can stay safe. And I think we often forget just how smart they are, and how educated they are about what they want for their own future. So I would say that that's probably the biggest thing, is just we don't know, they know, and how can we give them the opportunity to make their own choices? The second thing I would say is just housing. So we've already talked about this, about our unhoused population and the barriers to accessing housing. Oftentimes young people have a very difficult time with housing, just because, for two reasons. One, they don't have a credit history. So often when they run those background checks and they're trying to get an apartment, if they don't have a credit history, the apartment they can automatically deny them. So that's one barrier. Usually youth have access to a resource, so a family member, a mom and dad, or whoever, who can co-sign for them. But if they've been in foster care, or if they're not connected to that family isn't safe, then they might not have access to a co-signer either. So what are their options? And cash is definitely a way to kind of get around that. Like if you have the 3 months plus some, that landlord can feel more confident that you can take care of yourself and cover that rent, and you're able to get past that barrier. But without that, you're in a very difficult situation where you're staying with friends or you're couch surfing. And how can you build a future when you're not stable? So that's the other thing. And then the last thing I would say is just that mental health. So in the US, at my job, we do a lot of research on cash. So we don't just, we give the cash, it's no strings attached, but we also like to see what the impact is of cash. And one of the biggest things we see is mental health. So I know all of you can probably remember when you didn't have a lot of money and how that felt, and then you had enough, just to cover your bills and to feel safe and have that breathing room. That's a huge thing. When you have that space, you're able to plan for the future. You're also able to feel confident about like where you are now and where you hope to be. And I think that we often forget that cash can do that. It's very powerful. And the other thing is that when you have access to that cash, no one is telling you what to do with it. Like, I don't have to make it make sense for some big brother. I know what I need. I know what to do. I know how I want to live in the future. Here are the decisions I'm going to make. And I think we just need to focus on like giving that agency and empowerment to our youth. So I think a cash program could do all of those things.
So in 30 seconds or less, I give you a very loaded question. Why do you think folks, both policymakers and the general public, may seem apprehensive about cash transfer or basic income programs?
I have a super quick answer. I think most of it is just about deservedness. I think we talk a lot in our country about like being a rugged individual, who deserves help and who doesn't deserve help, and we're making a lot of determinations that are based on our own personal values, where we come from, what we were told. There's all these little things that go into it. But I think what we can all agree on is that everybody deserves to have dignity, to live with dignity, and if we really focus our attention there, then I think we can get out of just the nuances of like why cash doesn't work or why it shouldn't work, why we shouldn't give people cash. And the second thing is just that not running a cash program, so running our normal, program where you got to apply and do all these things and jump through all these hoops, those things are administratively expensive. And they also don't help us hit the people who need the money the most. It's really just the most savvy who can get through the process faster and not the most vulnerable. So if you really care about saving time and money, you would probably invest in a cash program over a giant program. That's just administratively crazy.
All right, thank you. And similarly to our other guest speakers, please hang on if you can, and we'll come back to a Q&A at the end. But with that, we'll move on to recommendation 2, long-term and emergency housing vouchers for youth and young adults. The Treasurer Award here goes to the state of Maine this year. Though not explicitly focused on youth or young adults, there were tangible actions to make housing vouchers more accessible and removing specific barriers, such as making waivers for expirations for participants to have more time to find housing, allowances for folks to look outside the area they received the voucher for housing in, and the ability to create educational and strategic initiatives for more landlords to accept housing vouchers. However, the trash award here goes to the state of New Jersey for falling short of transformation with required case management with the allowance of the administering department to terminate the voucher should the participant fail to participate in all of the required services. So jumping right into the discussion portion, I would like to welcome Away Home America's policy analyst, Karan Latourette.
Hey,
Karan, welcome.
I didn't realize it, but I'm wearing the same outfit in that photo. So
Also, I think that you did that intentionally and I love it.
no,
But in your
but
opinion, we'll jump right in. In your opinion, why would investment in low barrier access to housing vouchers for youth and young adults be a better long-term solution over other models such as transitional or congregate housing?
yeah, so I think with like housing vouchers, specifically for low access barriers, it provides youth the autonomy and privacy and decision making that is needed to survive in our housing market comparatively to transitional congregate housing. Autonomy is really important for youth to be able to have that confidence to later on to succeed in this housing market right now.
Thank you. And are there any final thoughts or big ideas that you would like to leave the audience with as it relates to this particular recommendation?
Yeah, it kind of circles back into what's been talking about lately, especially like specifically about these two states, because like both of these had like ways they wanted to break down barriers for youth and young adults. However, how they both went about it was completely different. Um, with Maine, they had more focus on uh, the about like breaking down the like barriers for like the expiration dates and also like having a decision on where you live, which are like actual complaints for those who have access housing vouchers. While with New Jersey, they didn't have that like perspective, and so they thought what would make them successful is required services. And I think when we're looking at youth ending youth homelessness, we need to be in partnership with youth and young adults to know the actual barriers that they're facing and trying to navigate housing.
Thank you for that. And we will move rapidly as we have 10 minutes left. Our last topic of discussion today is surrounding recommendation number 3, the investment in BIPOC and LGBTQIA plus communities. Very quickly, the Treasurer Award here goes to the District of Columbia with an intentionally transformative effort to invest in the Black LGBTQIA plus community by the preservation of their history in DC through a report produced by the Office of Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, and Questioning Affairs, specifically centering lived experts and community members throughout the entire process of the restoration of their own history. The Trash Award goes to Vermont as the planning and design of the proposed program lacks intentional engagement with the communities that it is aiming to serve. And as we near the end of our webinar today, we'll jump right into the discussion. And I would like to welcome Destiny Wiley Yancey, an Away Home America Youth Policy team member, and Destiny, just very quickly jumping on in light of the broad legislative overview that I gave from various states, are there any key takeaways, major thoughts, ideas that you would like to share with the audience?
Yes, of course. Here, I think, is the importance of community engagement with and the representation of minoritized communities in policymaking, especially when it comes to marginalized groups like BIPOC and LGBTQ communities. I think this policy in particular underscores the meaningful policymaking cannot be done in isolation from these communities, and rather demonstrates the value of not just making decisions for these communities, but just making decisions with them. And ultimately, I think what DC really encapsulates is that more informed, effective, and equitable policies must truly serve the needs of minoritized populations.
Thank you very much. And lastly, we have a special video from DC Council Member Zachary Parker, who was unable to join us today, but wanted to leave you all with his thoughts on the importance of this particular topic.
Hello, Away Home. I am Councilmember Zachary Parker, and I have the privilege of representing Ward 5's nearly 90,000 residents on the DC Council. I wish I could join you for your webinar, but my schedule would not permit it. So thank you for allowing me to pre-record this response. I'm really proud of the work that my team and I have led on a number of fronts, and during this last budget cycle, it illuminated why it is so important for us to intentionally invest in our marginalized communities, including the LGBTQ community. We know that homelessness is on the rise in the district, as well as violence against LGBTQ community members, namely our trans brothers and sisters. The same is true across the country. And so when we think about housing resources and lifelines of support, it is not just a roof over one's head, but it is literally a life or death advantage for so many. In this year's budget, in addition to being able to secure funding for our LGBTQ Center in Shaw with $1 million investment, we were able to make the LGBTQ office a standalone entity, which will allow for greater transparency and oversight for that critical agency. We were also able to secure 20 dedicated housing vouchers for LGBTQ residents. This was the first time that the council has invested in the LGBTQ community via dedicated vouchers in more than 2 years. And we know that housing is a need across the district, but it is uniquely so for LGBTQ residents, where there's a convergence of needs, including safety, housing, and connection to other life-saving resources. I was proud to pass and fund a commission that will research and publish a history and a full telling of the district's rich history of Black LGBTQ residents, because too often those stories are not told. There's an erasure, even among marginalized communities, and that will go a long way to ensuring our young people and all residents in the LGBTQ community can see themselves and have mirrors for the lives that they live. I am committed to doing more. As we know, there's so much more to do. But at this time, at an inflection point for our country and at an inflection point for the district, I am reminded that we need more voices advocating for our marginalized communities. We need dedicated policy targeting the needs of our communities. That is why I was going to bat for the LGBTQ community in this year's budget, while I will continue to do so. Because without that, when there are finite resources, oftentimes our most marginalized and vulnerable neighbors are left out of the discussion. If I could give one charge to all of you watching, it would be to continue to stay in the fight with us. Join us at a hearing, sign up to testify regarding legislation, come by the office and figure out ways that you can be a part of this policy-making process. I often say feedback is love, and policy making is a love language, because we know there is so much more that we need to do, and we can do so much more together. Thank you for having me tonight. We are just getting started. I couldn't be prouder of the work that we have already done, and I look forward to partnering with you in next year's budget and beyond as we work to combat homelessness and provide housing as a fundamental right for all district residents.
Thank you, Councilmember Parker, and thank I would like to thank all of our guest speakers today. Unfortunately, we are almost out of time. So if you do have any questions, please email me directly. I put my email in the chat. And please indicate if your question is for a specific speaker, and I will get you your question answered as soon as possible. We will also be sending out a recap, both the video and a PDF recap of all of the legislative overviews and our methodology of how we came to search through over 11,000 pieces of legislation to give you a lot of information in an hour. So with that, I will pass over to Fred to close us out.
Um, hello again, everyone. So I am Away Home America's Organizing and Policy Director. And I'd like to take a moment first and foremost to thank the Away Home America team for such an amazing webinar, and a huge thank you and shout out to all of our speakers, including our CEO, Marcella Middleton, Senator Terrell McKinney, Rep. Jennifer Bacon, Rep. Jennifer Stewart, Casman Ramos, the U.S. Program Manager for Give Directly, Karan LaTourette, Away Home America's policy analyst, Destiny Wiley Yancey, Away Home America's youth policy team member, and of course, last but not least, council member Zachary Parker. As Away Home America works towards increasing and implementing our policy footprint at both the federal, state, and local levels, we need you. And here are a few ways you can actually engage with us as we transform systems through public policy to end homelessness for Black, Indigenous, youth of color, and LGBTQIA+ youth on a path to housing justice for all. During our State of the Movement this year in Dallas, Texas, on October 23rd and 24th, Way Home America will officially be unveiling our new pilot project, Transforming the Way Home, or the New Deal, Transforming the Way Home, which is an initiative that will support 3 local communities to develop and strengthen state and local organizing campaigns across the country. In addition to that, we'll have our first state and local policy crew meeting, happening in September. This will be a space where state and local advocates and organizers can come together to learn, share ideas, and build collective strategies toward ending youth homelessness. And we invite you all to stay connected to our work by, one, signing up for our monthly newsletter to get updates on all of the amazing things that we're doing. You can RSVP for our upcoming State of the Movement. Again, that's October 23rd and 24th in Dallas, where we'll be unveiling Transforming the Way Home. You can sign up to receive our future advocacy alerts as we are doing our policy advocacy for our 118th Congressional Agenda. You can learn more about the New Deal on our website and check out a lot around our policy recommendations. And you can email me directly if you're interested in our state and local policy crew that is just starting. And so with that, I want to again thank you all for attending this year's Trash and Treasure webinar. And I look forward to being able to connect with you all in the future and really continuing to build out a movement that ends youth homelessness on a path to housing justice for all. Thank you all and have an amazing rest of the day.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you again for all of you joining us today. Thank you to our speakers, and I look forward to continuing to work with all of you in a variety of ways. And we'll see you next year for another Trash and Treasure.
You guys are awesome.
Thank you.